Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome to the Johnson Chayama Graduate School of Public Policy. My name is Jeremy Rayner. I am the director of the school, and it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists this morning on this, one of our series of panels, continuing series of panels on Canadian elections, federal and provincial. Our job this morning is to pick over the entrails of the 42nd federal election in Canada that took place on Monday. The Johnson Chayama School is a provincial school, one school, two campuses, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome our audience in Regina this morning. You see them there on the screen. I hope you're seeing us. And to welcome Giselle Marcotte, who is the Director of Outreach and Training at the Johnson Chayama School and will be moderating down in Regina. Thank you all for being here today. I'll introduce the panel first, and then I will ask them to give a brief overview on a number of topics that we've agreed upon, and to speak for no more than 10 minutes each. And then we'll open the floor to questions, which our distinguished panel can discuss. On my right, is that right? No, on your right, on my left, is John Courtney, Professor John Courtney, for many years in the Political Studies Department here at the University of Saskatchewan, now Senior Policy Fellow and Professor Emeritus at the University of Saskatchewan and the Johnson Chayama School. John should need no introduction to most of you, but he is a very distinguished researcher and writer on matters of elections and electoral processes, an international expert on elections, and particularly relevant to our most recent election, he was a member of the Electoral Boundaries Commission that redrew the boundaries of the thank you, electoral ridings in Saskatchewan with some predictable effects, perhaps not as many as we expected. On John's left is Danielle Bellon. Professor Bellon is a Canada Research Chair at the Johnson Chayama School, the organizer of these panels, and an expert on social policy and Canadian and comparative politics generally. On his left, Hai-Jen Mu is an associate professor in the school. She received her PhD from Carleton University and is an expert on health care economics, on public finance and public management. And perhaps she is the one who is going to tell us how the Liberals are going to balance that budget in the end with the various spending and tax cut proposals at the start. An interesting task. And on the far left of the panel, Michael Atkinson, Professor Michael Atkinson, for many years Provost and Vice President Academic at the University of Saskatchewan, and the Executive Director of the Johnson Chayama Graduate School until he stepped down this summer. Michael has been on leave, though this doesn't seem to have actually made any difference to his workload and what he's been doing, and we're very pleased that he can come and make up the panel for us today. Before I turn to John, however, I'd like to abuse my position as moderator for a moment and just say a few words about the election as I saw it. Much of the election commentary, of course, has been about contrasting styles. Who can forget the famous photograph taken when Stephen Harper first became Prime Minister, of him shaking hands with his young son as he saw him off to school, the very picture of formality and social conservatism. And now we have as a Prime Minister a man of whom the BBC yesterday could ask, as it did, is he the only leader currently in the world who sports a tattoo? This is a very different contrast in styles. And quite rightly, I think, we have seen the election as a conflict between those two different ways of living in the world. But I'd like to take you back to rather more than 20 years ago. We had in Canada a Conservative Prime Minister with a comfortable majority government but who was, it's I think not unfair to say, the most hated and reviled man in Canada. Brian Mulroney, for it is he, did not face the electorate at the end of his second term of office, but handed over his party, the old Conservative Party of Canada, to our first and so far only woman Prime Minister, who took that party and government to a catastrophic defeat in the election, going from a comfortable majority to just 2 seats and loss of official party status. And the effects of that defeat of the old Conservative Party, the party of John Diefenbaker, reverberated, I think, through Canadian politics for the last 20 years. The Liberals very comfortably faced, for a decade or more, a divided opposition in the federal parliament, with various conflicting regional bases, who took a very long time to organise themselves into a credible national opposition that could go to the electorate and say that we could form a national government in Canada. Of course, eventually the Conservative Party did manage to sink its differences between the new reformers and the old Conservatives. But even then, what we saw were a series of minority governments lasting through most all of the second half of the last decade. An increasingly sullen and dispirited and apathetic electorate continued to be asked the same question over and over again until they finally provided the right answer in 2011, and a Conservative majority government took over. At that time, many commentators, I actually remember a panel in this room at the time, speculating on whether the mould of Canadian politics had changed, whether we in fact now were moving to a more European model of a Conservative Party on one side of the House faced by a social democratic opposition on the other, with the Liberals inexorably squeezed into extinction between them, and generally a new party system was proposed. And yet we woke up on Tuesday morning, or at least I woke up on Tuesday morning, to a scene that would have been familiar to Justin Trudeau's father, to John Diefenbaker. A revived Liberal Party in government with representation right across the country, a very significant Conservative opposition, also with representation over most of the country, not the Maritimes, of course, and an NDP forced once again to the edges of Parliament, very comfortable numbers, but largely confined to its heartland in coastal British Columbia, the cities of the prairies, and the manufacturing cities of Ontario. There's a kind of traditional homely picture now to what the House of Commons is going to look like. And I'm very interested in what our panel is going to say about whether in fact that picture is misleading, or whether in fact we have come full circle to a parliament that, as I say, would have been very familiar to Pierre Trudeau or to John Diefenbaker. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Courtney, who's going to talk about some of those issues around strategic voting, around the turnout in this election, which was better than it has been in the immediate past, but not perhaps what some of us were thinking and hoping for. John.
Jeremy referred to a panel 4 years ago after the 2011 election. I remember it very well, so let's not go back there again because of the predictions, I think, that may have been made by the panelists. And you must promise now not to hold me to any of my predictions here. In fact, that will be very easy because I'm not going to predict anything. I'm going to instead talk about 3 subjects that have, in one way or another, been part of the subtext of this election. The first has to do with what you might call we all call voter turnout. The second is the public opinion polls, and the media have given us a lot of information through the polls over the course of the 78, 79 days. And the third has to do with strategic voting. As you know, if you follow the election very closely, and I assume that most everyone here has followed it closely, it was a very high turnout, not only nationally, much higher nationally, about 7 percentage points higher than in 2011, but in Saskatchewan, even higher than the national average. And we came in at something in the order of about 73% turnout. And that does not include, by the way, it fails to include those who were registered at the polling booth at the electoral district the day of the election. And my young friend Leland has pointed out, he was a DRO the other day, that about 10% of those who voted in his particular poll were added to the list that day. So we're going to see a higher turnout even than we already have. And that's one point I think to bear in mind. Jeremy has referred to the 1993 election, which was in many ways a watershed election. It brought to an end the old progressive conservative government. The old progressive conservative party, as we knew it, was soon to collapse and be folded into the conservatives. In 1993, there's exactly the same dynamics as in this election. You had a high degree of inter-party competition. There we had a more regionalized party system than we do now. In 93, the Bloc was obviously a big factor. The Reform Party was a big factor. And of course, you had the NDP, the Conservatives, the Progressive Conservatives, and the Liberals. So it was really a five-party competition. But people were mobilized. They were engaged in that election. And I think it's important to remember that one of the great predictive variables that we have as political scientists is the measure of voter engagement. If people are talking about the election, if they're discussing it with their friends, their families, their neighbors, they're much more likely to vote than if they just let the election pass and say they have no interest in it. And I have to say, around the university, having chatted with countless students and many of my colleagues over the course of the last, 78 days, I was struck by the degree to which people were actually talking about the election. I didn't hear the old saw, and that is, oh, I really don't care, it doesn't make any difference to me which party gets in, they're all the same. So bear in mind that the degree of party competition leads to an engaged electorate, and that in turn leads to higher voter mobilization. And in 93, which was the last really big measure of a popular electorate getting out to vote, that in many ways parallels the situation this time. A comment about public opinion polls. We're all familiar with the problems of polling, and there's no question about it. The days of the old land phone, when every family had one phone, those days are over. Now the electorate is a mobile electorate. You can no longer tie public opinion polls to residents because a lot of the people who are polled are not at home, they're on the road, they're away, they have their cell phone. So it no longer has that important component of being able to associate a residence with the demographic variables such as income, education, number of family members, and so on. Those days are all over. And each of the polling companies has tried in its own way to compensate for this. Some have worked better than others, but none is as strong as it was at one time. However, that said, some are undoubtedly better. I and Daniel and I were just chatting about this. I'm a great believer in the NANIS poll, which was CTV and Globe and Mail. And they run a tracking average of adding 400 every day for 3 days, dropping 400. So they have a continuous pool of potential voters, and they canvass them regularly. And listen to these figures. The last poll of NANIS predicted the Liberals with 39.1%. This is extraordinary. They got 39.5%. The Conservatives were predicted by NANIS to get 30.5. They got 30.5. It's extraordinary. The NDP predicted by Nanas, 19.7, they got 19.7. So this, I mean, if he ever had any reason to uncork the champagne that night, Nick Nanas could certainly celebrate. However, once you start getting into what we might call in just a moment the strategic element of this, you've got a problem. Because a number of the polling firms, if you looked at Poll Tracker or the Signal and the Toronto Star, you saw the problem, and that is they predict the number of seats. Not only that, the number of seats, but they also predict who's going to win a particular seat. Now, stop to look at Ipsos Reid. They predicted Libs 38%, Conservatives 31%, NDP 22%. Pretty good, certainly within the margin of error. But they then followed that through by saying the Liberal share of the vote will translate into 140 seats, the Conservatives will get 115, and the NDP 79. So the predictions in terms of number of seats were way off the mark. Which leads me to my third comment, and that is strategic voting. And we heard a great deal about that. There were organizations such as Lead Now and so on that were set up across the country to get people to vote strategically, because 7 out of 10 Canadians had admitted in various polls and studies that they wanted to get rid of Harper and the Harper government. Now, there are 2 points to be made. It's a double-edged sword, as I would say, strategic voting. On the one hand, it's a very easy concept to understand. It's simple. It's not the least bit complicated. You want to maximize the utility of your vote by casting a vote for the person, not necessarily your most favorite, but the one who has the greatest likelihood of defeating the one is your least favorite. I mean, this is straight rational choice kind of thinking. So you want to maximize the utility of your vote. And we can all understand that. It's a very simple proposition. Yet, to do this exercise properly, you're dealing with uncertainty. You have to have as many cues as you can about who to vote for, and the polling data, as I just pointed out, can sometimes lead you wildly wrong. And I'll give you a couple of examples before I close my 10 minutes. Let me give you 2 examples, both from Saskatchewan. The Signal, which was one of the tools that was used by the Toronto Star, aggregated all the polls on a daily basis. So you'd had ECOS, Ipsos, and so on. All of these were aggregated. It's not as if it was a polling firm, but they took all the polls and they aggregated them. The Signal then broke it down by who's going to win in the constituencies, and you could look up any one of 338 ridings and you would find out the predicted winner. Here's a prediction for Saskatchewan. Desnethe, Mississippi, and Churchill River. Signal predicted a Conservative win with the NDP second and the Liberal third. Well, as we know, in fact, the Conservatives came third, and the NDP and the Liberals are still possibly going to face a recount in that it was so close between the two. So if you relied on your strategic vote and how you would cast the vote to stop Harper in that particular election, you would vote NDP. But yes, that's right. You would vote NDP. Saskatoon University. They predicted, again the Signal, that the Liberal candidate, Cindy Block, would come second to the Conservative, Brad Trost. Block, in fact, came in third. Now you can run through. I just gave these 2 quite at random examples of the problem. So when you come to vote, my belief is vote sincerely, because you're much more likely to have, at the end of the day, uncertain information, unclear information, imperfect information about how your vote should be cast. You're second guessing. you're much better to believe in what you want to do sincerely than what you should be doing strategically. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you for coming here this morning. So I will build on what John said, and I will explain you what happened on Monday. Why did the Conservative lose, and why the Liberals ended up with a majority government? I think I have a simple explanation. Maybe it's too simple, but according to polls, of course, most Canadians wanted to change government. Depending on the polls, varied between 65 and towards the end of the campaign, 71% of Canadians wanted to get rid of the Harper government. And at the beginning of the campaign, the NDP claimed that they were the ones who could displace the Conservatives, and the polls backed that assertion to a certain extent. But what happened during the campaign, in part because of the niqab issue, in part because the type of campaign that the NDP ran and their platform, which was quite centrist, they lost some ground in Quebec quite rapidly. And, you know, the niqab issue was what they call the dead cat strategy on the part of Conservatives. People were talking about the Duffy trial. People were talking about the state of the economy, which was not going that well. Then they threw this issue out of nowhere on the table, held by a federal court that ruled in that matter. But that was planned ahead of time, that they will raise this issue during the campaign. They did. And they had looked at the polls, and they knew that in Quebec especially, this will have an effect on voters. And it did. And as the NDP started to drop in the polls in Quebec, it also started to drop in the polls nationally. And Canadians who wanted to get rid of the Harper government, they started to think that the Liberals will actually be the vehicle for change rather than the NDP. And then more people over time, the support for the NDP after the niqab episode, support for the Liberals started to increase quite steadily. If you look at the poll, especially the Nanos poll, it was quite accurate, spot on, as John said. And the Liberals also ran a very effective campaign. The expectations were very low regarding Trudeau, but he went way above the expectation. It's not just because of him, it's because he had a great team. And they also ran a rather sunny campaign compared to the two other parties, which were basically, the NDP were, of course, attacking Harper very hard. And the Conservative had only played the fear card. And they had very little in terms of a positive message. And so they ran, and they had, of course, the economy against them and the Duffy trial and other issues. So they ran a negative campaign. And in the end, Trudeau and its contingent, in a way, it's a series of events, and the fact that they ran a very good campaign. In the end, people voted for them because they thought it was the best way to get rid of the Harper government. And of course, maybe many of the people who voted for the Liberals, they thought it would be a Liberal minority government. But in a way, this move, this kind of collective action trend, in a way, was even more successful than many people thought, even some Liberal organizers, and they ended up with a majority government. And that's the story of this election in a nutshell. Now, you may not agree with my interpretation, but I think it's certainly worth discussing. Now, let's look at the regions. You know, here in Saskatoon, we have a map. You don't see it in Regina, but you can see part of the country here. Very interesting, if you look at the different regions of the country. Of course, Atlantic Canada is all red, all 32 seats. Very strong anti-Harper sentiments in Atlantic Canada overall. Even some long-standing NDP MPs were booted out. Quebec, very interesting, 40 out of 78 seats went to the Liberals. This is the first time since the Mulroney years that Quebecers vote, that are now, the majority of seats in Quebec are with the ruling government, the ruling party. You know, because under Chrétien and Martin, the Bloc was dominant in Quebec, and then early in the Harper years as well, and then after that the Bloc collapsed, the NDP took over, but the NDP was also in the opposition from 2011 to 2015, and now for the first time since the Trudeau years, the Quebecers are now, they have the majority of seats in the context of a majority Liberal government in Ottawa, which is so quite stunning, actually. And it's an important change. Ontario also turned red, quite largely. And especially in the Toronto, of course, City of Toronto and Toronto area, again, sometimes at the expense of the NDP. Again, the idea that the NDP would be the, so it's not strategic voting like you look at your own riding. You just think, you know, how can we get rid of Harper? You don't necessarily do the calculus. Some people did in their own riding, but they were just thinking there is something like a shift towards the Liberals, and that's the only way to get rid of the Conservatives. So that's probably what a lot of Canadians did. We'll have to look at the research done by, I know some people like Dave McGrain have run some polling and surveys, and we'll see what their research findings are. And it's too early to have a, you know, really the final word on what happened. But I think that in the end, the facts would back my interpretation. Well, I hope so. Okay. Now, if you look at the West, it's very interesting. And even from the perspective of the country as a whole, Saskatchewan is the only province with fewer than 4 Liberal MPs. They got 7 Liberal MPs in Manitoba. They got 4 in Alberta, 2 in Edmonton, 2 in Calgary, which is, again, first time in in decades that they get Liberal seats in Calgary. And then British Columbia is, there is quite a few NDP seats, but the Conservatives lost seats, and the Liberals, again, have, I think, 17 seats, so quite a good showing for the Liberals there. What does it mean for Saskatchewan? Well, this is not necessarily good news in the sense that, yes, the NDP won 3 seats, and the anti-Harper vote here still crystallized more around the NDP than around the Liberal Party for obvious historical reasons. Pretty clear historical patterns here. And the change in the riding structure, I think, helped the NDP, certainly in Saskatoon West, even if people had voted the same thing, the same way, exactly the same way as in 2011, they would have won that riding. And it also helped in Regina for 1 seat. But if you look at the entire province right now, unless we have a recount in the north and that the Liberals end up ahead, right now it's the NDP ahead, we imagine that Saskatchewan has only Ralph Goodale. Of course, only Ralph Goodale. Ralph Goodale is a monument in Canadian politics, is the only MP in Ottawa, he will be the only MP who served under both Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Justin Trudeau, because Goodale was first elected in 1974 and then was booted out in 79 and ran again later. But Goodale is the only politician in Canada who can say, I serve under both Trudeaus in the caucus, and he will become a major, of course, minister, not just for regional, in terms of regional balance, because he's the only MP from Saskatchewan, but because he's actually a seasoned politician, very experienced. Policy wonk as well. But what does it mean for Saskatchewan? We have a Wall government. We have a Conservative government in this province, not called Conservative, but Wall was quite close to the Harper government on many issues. Wall now is one of the, if you look at the map of provincial governments in Canada, you have 2 NDP and 6 Liberal provincial governments. You only have 1 progressive Conservative government in Newfoundland and Labrador. So if you add the population of these 2 provinces, Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador, it's very small, okay? And the 3 biggest provinces, Ontario, Quebec, and BC, are controlled by the Liberals, although the Liberals in BC are kind of a strange, a kind of coalition conservative liberal at the provincial level, but still. And you have the 2 neighbors, Manitoba, no, not for that long probably anymore, and especially Alberta are orange. So Brad Wall is quite isolated. And Justin Trudeau, my expectation is that he will engage way more with premiers than Stephen Harper did. I suspect that we'll have more first ministers' conferences than under Harper. It's not hard to do because Harper barely did it only a few times. But if you take the full duration of his 9 years in power, minority and then majority government. But that's, I think, important that there will be more engagement with the provinces, certainly. And then what will be the role of Saskatchewan? What Brad Wall did this summer, and even during the campaign, trying to steer the pot over equalization, for example, is probably not the best way to engage with the new Liberal government that has 32 seats in Atlantic Canada, 40 in Quebec, and 7 in Manitoba, okay? Regions of the country that have received equalization payments for a long time, more or less. It's not the case for Newfoundland and Labrador more recently, but still. I think it's very, very important to keep that in mind. Bradwell has a challenge in front of him. It's the first time that Bradwell will have to govern facing a non-conservative federal government, because he was elected in 2007, Harper was already in place. And now he's surrounded by basically provinces that are not so conservative, that have a different stance on the environment, a different stance on a host of issues. Yesterday, I think yesterday Bradwell called Justin Trudeau, and he told him, it's reported, he told him that he would support the idea of an inquiry on murdered and missing Aboriginal women. So there is some ground for agreement here, but it will depend a lot on what Harper will decide to do. Will he decide to be the last voice of Western alienation and the energy industry, or will he try to actually engage with other premiers and with the new Prime Minister to move this country forward? This is, of course, I don't have an answer to this question, but I hope this will be something will follow over the following months. And we have an election coming in Saskatchewan too, probably in the spring, in April, probably. So I'm not sure the actual Bradwell remains extremely popular in Saskatchewan. So the question is more, rather Bradwell will place cards well in the intergovernmental arena, and whether he will help defend, promote the interest of Saskatchewan, but also help move this country forward together in partnership with the new federal government and with the other provinces. Thank you very much.
Just added on what Daniel explained why this election went to a Liberal instead of Conservative. One of the reasons, beyond those the factors explained by Daniel, one of the reasons I think is the economic policy. It's the Liberal design, the type of economic policy that the people in Canada want to see. Some media said the turning point in this campaign is actually after 3 weeks. 3 weeks after the starting of the campaign, that when Liberal took the risk and proposed a budget deficit and new spending. So that influenced the polls and the people's opinion, the final voting. So I will focus on 3 aspects of the new economic policy of the Trudeau government. The first one is the current status of the economy and the budget deficit policy, and what's the implication on the Canadian economy and our debt ratio. The second one is the new spending proposed by the Trudeau government and the allocation of the spending. What does it mean for Saskatchewan? The third one is the middle income tax cut and the probably other tax policy of that time. So the first one, as some of you probably see today, the Bank of Canada tabled a new monetary report today, exactly today, this morning, and it downgraded the economic outlook for Canada. So the expected real GDP growth rate this year will be just above 1%. It's really low historically. And the global economic growth on average would be around 3%. So both internally, externally, it's not a very good economic environment for Canada. We can certainly call this is a mild recession. It's not great compared to the 2008 recession. So from this point of view, Trudeau's stimulus package of the budget deficit and spending makes sense from economist's point of view. So the proposed budget deficit, it's 10 billion per year for 3 years, and Trudeau promised that the government will balance the budget by 2019. So put this number in perspective. 10 billion deficit is actually not big in Canada, in Canadian history. After 2008, under Harper government, the total debt, most are from the accumulated deficit, is the total debt added onto the economy is $150 billion. And in 2009, the deficit is $55 billion, so 5 times of the $10 billion. And in terms of the percentage to the economy, we measure like the total amount of deficit as a percentage of GDP. So Trudeau's 10 billion deficit is, I roughly calculate, is less than 1% of Canadian GDP. And this is less than before in 2009, 2010, and 2011. And it's way below, what people worried. Like in the 1990s, it's like around 5% of the GDP. So some people worried, say, the Harper government argument, if we have the responsibility for balancing our own personal finance, why should the government balance its own finance? The cases, they are a little bit different, but sometimes similar. For a country or business, some of you maybe business owners, balanced budget may not be a good thing. And even for us, personal individuals, we also borrow, right, to buy a house or car. You don't wait until you balance budget every year. So from economist point of view, budget deficit, like what we found from John with Michael, our research found, balanced budget actually is not as a goal or end of policy. It's just one of the policy instrument for government. The actual goal of government economic policy is not about budget, it's about economic growth rate, particularly from a long run perspective. So the budget deficit was reacted positively by the market yesterday. Probably not much about the budget deficit. It's about because Canada had a stable majority government. So the stock market and the loonies both responded quite positive yesterday, both a jump. However, the main driving force for our economy, again, is not budget deficit or politics. It's the economic growth potential. It's the productivity in Canada. So from yesterday's example, although the election result boosted the economy, the prospect a little bit, but the dropping in the oil price again corrected this prospect, the outlook. So more importantly is the energy sector, the manufacturing sector, and the other sector, and the overall competitiveness and productivity in Canada relative to the other countries in the global economy context. And Trudeau's budget deficit will have some boost to the economy because the new spending on transit, for example, transportation, will help every sector, including agriculture sector. And so it will create new jobs and will increase the long-term efficiency and productivity in this country. And people worried about how about the debt, once you have a deficit, you add on to debt. The debt level today in Canada it's not, according to former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge, debt in central government is not an issue at all, because our debt to GDP ratio today is only like 31%. It's way below, what people worry. 1990s is more than 60%, and in the US is more than 80%. Some people, my friend called me, what? This will lead to Canada to the second Greece, probably. Oh no, it's far from Greece. Greece's debt ratio is more than 150%, so 5 times our debt ratio. So it's not a big deal for now to add a little bit of debt from a statistical point of view. So this is the first about the budget deficit and the debt policy. The second one is about the new spending on infrastructure. The new spending on infrastructure, Trudeau promised this will be divided to 3 separate accounts. One is public transit, one is the social infrastructure, which including some social policy, for example, housing, right? And the third one is the green infrastructure. So, and the allocation is interesting. Allocation is, since like Daniel said, this is one of the blue list promise in the country. How much will Saskatchewan get? How big a share will Saskatchewan get? The case is I reviewed their proposed allocation criteria. So far, what they promised is only a more transparent allocation project evaluation criteria. So it seems like it's still case-by-case evaluation and approval. That means there is some room for politics and manipulation. So this is different from what the premiers had pushed years ago in Niagara Falls, led by the Ontario premier. They want a formula. They want a formula which can balance between, for example, regional interest, right? So far, the truth formula is still case by case, arbitrary. So we will see what will that mean for Saskatchewan. However, what they proposed is the financing structure for infrastructure is they will establish a national infrastructure bank. This is a new idea, which means because the current federal government has a much higher credit rating than some provincial government and the local government. So if federal government borrow money, right, they will have a lower interest rate and borrowing cost. So what Trudeau proposed is they will establish this bank, so the federal government will back up the loan, will guarantee the loans borrowed by provincial government or local government to help them finance projects. So from economist point of view, this is a good move because why not, as a country, you lower the total interest rate. This is for the infrastructure. The third one is the middle income tax cut and the other tax policy. Middle income tax cut, the Trudeau's proposal is to cut income following between around $44,000 to $89,000 from the marginal tax rate from 22% on this range of income to 20.5%, so 1.5% tax cut. People sometimes misunderstood, say this is a middle income tax cut. Actually, this is tax cut for everybody who the income is above $44,000, because this is the way our progressive income tax works. As the portion of your income following in that range, you all get it. As long as you follow that, you get a cut. So this policy is financed by increased tax rate for high top 1%. By the tax rate increased by 4%, from 29% to 33% for those who earn $200,000 per year and above. So I put this in the perspective of the internationally. So compared with the American personal income tax system, this is actually not new because their middle class. If I treat their tax bracket for single person, is people who earn $37,000 US to $90,000 US, they pay 25%, so a higher rate than our so-called middle class income bracket. And however, if you earn like $18,000 and above, then your marginal tax rate would be at the minimum 33%. You know, the new proposed tax rate, and can be up to 39.6% for those who earn $41,000 and above. So our tax system is less progressive than the Americans, and it's interesting is Trudeau's idea of this progressive income tax, which can try to reduce a little bit of income inequality. Seems like it's not new. This is actually a similar proposal proposed in 2011 by the NDP leader Brian Top. So they proposed to add a new tax bracket for those earning $250,000 and above. So the tax rate they propose is 35%, even a little bit higher than Trudeau. So I think this is probably one of the reasons the Liberals can grab some seats from NDP because they kind of move a little bit less when NDP moved to the center, you know, kind of alienate their base. And they complementary to this income tax adjustment. People worried how about low income people? You know, those middle class, high income, all benefit somehow, and not the top 1%, except for the top 1%. How about low income people? Why this tax policy didn't help fight poverty, for example? The case is they propose this Canada child benefit. They will cancel universal child care benefit. So high income people won't receive any child benefit, but the new Canada child benefit would be very generous to low income people. If your family income is below $15,000 per year, then if you have 2 children, the Canada child benefit will give you $11,000 tax-free, and this time is tax-free. So it's a very generous child benefit. And if your income goes up, your benefit is starting just dropping until if your family income is more than $200,000, then it's nothing. So it's another progressive kind of similar, like the tax system, it's a progressive benefit system. I will stop here probably, but if you have other questions.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the movement from the election to government. And that's what we're going to be watching over the next several months. And our judgment of Mr. Trudeau and his team will now turn on less on his promises, more on his policies and the actual implementation, and of course on how he actually intends to govern. He's proven to be an excellent campaigner. He has gone to election school and passed with flying colors, mostly because he's proven to be an effective communicator, effective listener too. And that's what democratic elections are really all about. Messaging, staying on message, timing, patience, and good luck is always useful. Okay. Mr. Trudeau said somewhere in the middle of the campaign, I set the frame, and that's right. And he did set the frame, and I think he did a good job. Now, governing, on the other hand, is about exercising authority. It starts with choosing an executive team and then providing direction to it and to the public service. It's about mastering files, creating a legislative agenda, exercising administrative discretion, and dealing with the unexpected. Now, listening and communication skills, the kind that you saw on display in the election, those are good. Those are very useful. But you're going to need more than that, starting with the one thing that Mr. Trudeau doesn't have, and that's experience. You need experience because experience is the main source of good judgment. In its absence, you have to rely on other people to help build your own sense of priorities and your own leadership style. It's going to take a little bit of time. And just like in any transition, the people who are managing Mr. Trudeau now, and I use that in the most neutral sense, not managing as in directing, but just looking after, are anxious to know what kind of style Mr. Trudeau is going to bring to government. So for a government without experience like this one, the transition phase is really crucial. And assuming the Liberals aren't totally surprised at their victory, and so that they neglected to figure out how they were going to run a government, they've been getting ready probably about a year ago. They probably created a transition team then. Even though prime ministers don't like transition teams so much, they think it's kind of bad karma, generally, to do that. But they've got to, and planning has been going on for quite some time now, and it's not just the Liberal Party as an electoral machine that's doing this planning. Typically what happens, and it will happen with Conservatives as well, they bring in old hands, old policy hands, many of them with senior positions within the public service. People like Art Kroger really helped Mr. Chrétien, and people like Derek Burney helped Mr. Harper. So it's not just a matter of taking the election team and turning them into a transition team. You kind of put the old people and the new people together. And these people are not concerned about policy. Policy is not their remit. They're concerned about the machinery of government. How are we going to organize this government to get the policy promises and the agenda actually constructed? And the government, in the narrow sense of the public service, they're getting ready too. They will have been getting ready for quite some time now, looking at the platforms. The clerk of the Privy Council in particular will be organizing how this government is going to actually implement the sorts of things that Haijin was talking about. Less experienced politicians, like the ones we're getting, are going to need more help from that public service. So the chemistry between the public service and the incoming government is going to be critically important. Now in Australia and the UK, they make a habit, governments make a habit of allowing the clerk of the Privy Council, the most senior public servant, an opportunity to speak with the opposition leaders before even an election is called. So in the anticipation of an election, they get together and have a kind of beginning conversation. We've done that in Canada, but not recently. So Mr. Martin wasn't in favor of that. Mr. Harper didn't encourage that. So that puts and I'm not sure quite what happened here, but my guess is Mr. Harper was not happy, would not have been happy to see the clerk of the Privy Council talking to Mr. Trudeau or Mr. Mulcair. So now the conversations start. And this is the phase we're in right now, this post-election phase of the transition. This is the most intense. I think Mr. Trudeau announced that he will announce his cabinet, the cabinet will be sworn in on November 4th, something like that. That's about right, that's about average. You don't have a lot of time. So, you better have been thinking about this in advance, and rest assured, people will be. There's a lot of vetting going on right now, a lot of jockeying, a lot of fussing around as to who is going to go where. In addition to which, a lot of ordering council appointments are now being lined up. There are like 600 full-time ordering council appointments, about 2,300 part-time. These aren't going to be made like at once or anything like that, but the Prime Minister's office needs to gear up to start making those kinds of appointments. The organization of cabinet is going to be really important. And again, I go back to what I said about Mr. Trudeau's style. Peter O'Coin wrote a great piece contrasting the original Mr. Trudeau and his cerebral style of government with Mr. Mulroney, who had what Peter called a transactional style. And then what he did was then derive from those two styles the way in which cabinet was organized and how they use cabinet. The same thing is going to happen here in all likelihood. Let's figure out what makes Mr. Trudeau comfortable and the people around him comfortable, and then we'll organize central government kind of around that. Once you get this new cabinet in place, once the swearing-in has happened, then inside minister's office, lots of hiring is going on. I mean, the exempt staff, these are the people who are not hired through the public service, those staffs are turning over 100%. So all of the people who are working in ministers' staffs in the Harper government are gone. Whole bunch of new people have to be hired. They have to be vetted. This is a chaotic kind of period. And in a way, it has to kind of begin to happen now. I don't know quite how this government is doing it, but my guess is they're vetting people already, not knowing which minister is going into which portfolio. And sometimes ministers will kind of be given executive assistants who have been selected centrally. But the point here is lots of change going on. Now, the good news in the case of Mr. Trudeau is that, and I'm guessing here, but I think I'm safe in saying that he's likely to have a lot of support within the public service, and he's likely to feel very comfortable with the senior leadership in the public service. I say that because my sense is that they're looking to him as a person who sees government as a positive force, and they've been through 9 years of a person who doesn't. And so, the chemistry is it's set. It's possible anyway. Mr. Diefenbaker, he had a hell of a time transitioning into government. And for obvious reasons, he thought the public service was really stacked with liberals. And he had every reason to think so. I mean, the cabinet that he just defeated, people like obviously Lester Pearson, Jack Pickersgill, Mitchell Sharp was in that government. They were all at one point or another public servants, and then they transitioned into government. So when he came in, he wasn't so happy about all of the people who were there, very suspicious of them. I don't think we're going to get that here with Mr. Trudeau, and that's really a good thing. Now, my last point. In all of this transition business, Parliament is typically a bit of an afterthought. When people in the Privy Council office talk about the machinery of government, they typically don't have Parliament in mind. And Mr. Trudeau's already decided, he's already told us what he's going to do on a number of files. He's already agreed to the study of the murdered and missing Aboriginal women, and there'll be more announcements about his policies well before Parliament comes. And that's not unusual, and you shouldn't draw the wrong conclusion about that. Mr. Chrétien, who before he was sworn in, he canceled the helicopter contract. He halted the privatization of Pearson Airport. He did a number of things. Mr. Harper, he developed his 5 priorities in 2008 during the election campaign, not when he got into office. And they're doing this in part to assert their authority and in part to establish a little bit of distance and tell people who's really in charge here. And that's not an unreasonable thing for anybody to do. As he transitions, though, into this office, Mr. Trudeau is going to find a real tension. And I think it's a tension peculiar to him in some ways. Wouldn't have happened with Mr. Harper or I think Mr. Mulcair. And that is the tension between his inclusive, open style, the one that he showed us yesterday morning shaking hands with the constituents in Papineau, with the need for rationing attention, maintaining discipline, setting firm goals. These are the elements of governing. We haven't seen Mr. Trudeau in this role yet. He's going to have to develop it. And like all of the prime ministers in front of him, he will use the prime minister's office to discipline his ministers. He'll use the Privy Council office to provide direction to deputies. He's not going to break from that pattern, and I don't think we want him to. So here's the trick then, here's the question. Can he govern democratically? We know he can master the elements of democracy, the electoral elements. Can he govern democratically? I think Mr. Harper, on the whole, failed to govern democratically. I don't think he was particularly interested in it. I'm not sure that prime ministers before Mr. Harper were particularly interested in it either, although each one had their own particular style. Mr. Trudeau's father toyed with the idea of participatory democracy, but he never really implemented any forms based on that idea. Mr. Martin famously declared that there was a democratic deficit, and he thought that the MPs being so tightly fettered was a main reason for it. He never really got around to doing very much about it. Mr. Harper's commitment to Parliament as an institution was really minimal. In fact, he was notoriously harsh at handling dissent within his own caucus. He allowed backbenchers to some room only strategically. And the motion that defeated his government in 2011 included a judgment that he'd shown contempt for Parliament for failing to release information related to the cost of crime legislation and the purchase of those aircraft. It'd be interesting to know what happens to those aircraft. What's going to happen with Mr. Trudeau? He's shown in his treatment of Liberal senators that he's willing to break with tradition in unexpected ways. So here's some things to watch for. Will he allow the caucus the right to decide who is accepted into the parliamentary party and who is expelled from the parliamentary party? Will he agree to empower the caucus as a force to force a vote on or a reconsideration of his own leadership? Will he allow members of standing committees the right to choose their own chairs and vice chairs? There's an indication that he's going to allow that. Will he allow more free votes, or at least reduce the number of votes that require a three-line whip? Will he give parliamentarians the right to vet and vote on order in council appointments? There seems to be a consensus among journalists that Mr. Trudeau is going to bring a different tone to government. And I think for most of them, they're thinking, well, that means more access to the media, and that's good. That's nice. In my opinion, how Mr. Trudeau treats Parliament, that will be the question about whether this tone that we're talking about now is actually followed through. And if he treats Parliament with respect, who knows, he may get some respect in return, in which case, if that happens, we'll all know that we've died and gone to heaven. So,